I am so happy to be here tonight. Seeing such a far-reaching event like TEDx happen in such a small town really reminds me that big things are possible even in some of the least likely places. And I feel like that belief in big things happening in unlikely places is a real big motivating factor in the work that I do, which is to bring yoga and meditation programs to youth who are basically growing up in some pretty challenging environments, whether those are custody facilities or neighborhoods that experience socioeconomic issues and other challenges. Another part of this evening that really resonated with me is our theme of adaptation. And adaptation is something that myself and my team consider a great deal in relation to the young people that we work with. Many of the youth that we come into contact with, I believe, have had to adapt to these challenging environments where they're growing up. And so the theme tonight is very, very relevant. If you look up the term adaptation, the word adaptation in a dictionary, what you'll find is that with many of the definitions, another key word comes up over and over again. And that key word is survival. And so I think it's important, at least from the angle that I'm coming at tonight in my talk, is to look at adaptation not simply as change, but more specifically as change with the goal of surviving. And it's also important maybe to expand on that a little bit and understand that survival doesn't just have to mean literally staying alive, which it often means for many people. But I think as human beings, we attempt to survive in many less literal ways. I believe that we have sort of an intrinsic willfulness to remain intact as human beings, mentally, emotionally. For some, they would maybe say spiritually. We have a desire, a basic desire to feel safe and secure and supported. And I believe that these are also ways that we look to survive. So I'd like to share a story with you from my own life. Several years ago, I was sexually assaulted. And at the time, of course, that event was a very terrifying event. And at the immediate time that followed that event was also, of course, very scary, filled with lots of emotions such as anxiety, fear, shame. But in the big picture of my life, I actually didn't consider this event to be one of the sort of main shaping events of my life. I actually felt like I got over this event, got over maybe in quotations, fairly quickly. So much so that a few years ago I was taking a workshop to do with yoga and trauma. And on the very first day of the workshop, the facilitator asked the participants to think of an event in our lives that we would consider challenging but not traumatizing. We were going to get to the traumatizing stuff like on day 3, once we had sort of eased in. So much so did I not consider this event of being sexually assaulted a traumatizing event, that this is the event that I chose that was like not a triggering event, something that I considered challenging but not really too big a deal. And so each of us chose our challenging event, and we were led through a guided meditation. And during this guided meditation, I started to notice some feelings coming up. And as we went further and further into this exercise, the feelings became more and more intense. Some of them were physical responses, elevated heart rate, I was sweating, my body was heating up. And eventually all this kind of culminated in breaking down, crying uncontrollably. So that was a little red flag for me. Maybe something's up. And I began to realize that this event had, in fact, affected me in ways that I wasn't aware of. And I sort of embarked then on a journey of looking further into what were my responses to this event? What was I still carrying with me? How was this event continuing to impact my life? what I realized is that I had adapted to the situation and to the fear that I had experienced in ways that were unknown to me. Some of those adaptations, to give you an example, included things like avoiding the types of spaces that reminded me of where this happened. At least if I was going there, I would not go there alone. Distancing myself from intimate relationships, distancing myself from men, creating a sort of angry type of armor that people who were close enough to me got to experience from time to time. And there's two key things that I'd like to emphasize tonight or kind of shine a light on about the ways that I had adapted. The first one is that in no way did I experience these adaptations as options. So at no point in my life did I sit down and say to myself, wow, that was a very scary experience. Now what should I do to feel safer? Okay, I'm going to do A, B, and C. So instead, these behaviors, the ways that I changed how I lived in the world, these things were instinctual. They were reactions, natural reactions to feeling threatened. And so that's the first point that I'd like to make tonight, is that in my understanding of adaptation, again, change with the sort of very primal goal to survive, these types of changes, I believe, are very often, if not always, unconscious. The second thing that I noticed in looking back at my own experience was that the changes that I had gone through, while maybe you could argue initially may have served me to keep me safe or to have me feel a sense of safety, ultimately caused me harm. So these adaptive behaviors that I had taken on that were meant to make me feel safe and secure and comfortable, in fact, when I looked deeper at these ways of being, I realized that they actually served to distance me from relationships, to limit my experience of joy in my life, and to, in a sense, take away my power because my freedom was taken away. I didn't feel free to go where I wanted or be how I wanted or do what I wanted. And so the second point to summarize that I like to make about adaptation is that it's possible that even while adaptations serve us, that they can also harm us. And so for these two reasons, not to beat up too much on adaptation, but I'd like to suggest that adaptation can be problematic. The young people that I have gotten to know in the programs that I lead and who come through the programs that other teachers that I work with lead are experiencing violence or threat of some kind, I think in many different, varied, and sometimes complex ways. These forms of threat can happen at the level of their home life, coming from abusive homes, neglectful homes, homes that are struggling to pay the bills and be present, having parents present for their children. The threat can come at the level of their community, and this is something that's a very common thread through the situations of the young men and women that I know, where violence is a daily occurrence in many of their neighborhoods. Crime is happening all around them, drugs are all around them. And I would suggest that even sort of above that, in perhaps sometimes a less tangible way, that the young people that I know are faced with threat on the level of society or institutional level, meaning that many of them are grappling with racism, classism, and other forms of marginalization. And so I think it's important that we ask ourselves, what happens to individuals, especially young people, when they are being given either very obvious or even subtle messages that they're not good enough, that they don't matter, that they don't deserve to be heard, that they don't have a place in our world, that they have nothing to contribute. And then the question becomes, how do those young people adapt to receiving those messages and believing what they may believe about themselves as a result of those messages? So, where does yoga come in with all of this? You may be wondering. As I alluded to in my own life example that I shared, when I pointed out that it happened to be within the context of a yoga workshop that I became aware of some of my own adaptations. Basically, well, I would guess that most people here, yoga is a pretty popular activity today, and I would guess that most people have at least a very basic understanding of what yoga is. So probably, I'm guessing, you understand it to be some kind of exercise regime, maybe something where people put their bodies in strange kind of pretzel-y poses. Maybe it has something to do with relaxation you've heard or you've experienced. And all of those things are right. All of those things are part of yoga. But I would also suggest that that kind of very mainstream definition of yoga is quite limited. For me, the heart of yoga, and I can't get into all the history and philosophy tonight, but maybe just know that there is a very vast tradition behind yoga, teachings that come along with it. But the heart of all of those teachings for me, I think can sort of be summarized or boiled down to mindful awareness. Mindful awareness. And one of my teachers always makes a point of saying that mindful awareness is not just attention, not just bare attention, which it's often maybe sort of misconstrued as. But it's almost like you could think of it as like kind attention. Attention that rests on a foundation of compassion, of truthfulness, of kindness. So kind of like a gentle attention. And I believe that it's through this sort of kind attention that people can have the opportunity, as I did, to begin to look at their lives, look at how they live in the world, investigate what they've been through and how they carry those experiences with them and how they've adapted to those experiences in ways that may have served them but may now be causing them to suffer. This sounds like a lot. You know, if you go to your first yoga class, it's like, well, that's like a lot of expectation. But, you know, it starts really simply. Just to kind of break it down really practically, in a yoga class, maybe you're doing a pose and you're stretching out your hamstrings. And the teacher says something to you like, notice where you feel this. That's the beginning. Notice what's happening right now. And then they might say something like, if they see you making funny faces when the pose hurts a little bit or you're going a little bit too far, and they might say something like, notice if you're competing with yourself. Notice if you're competing with the person beside you. Notice if you're suffering through this pose, and see if you can find a way to do it in a calm, relaxed fashion. And that's the kind part. So as people begin to practice these small, practical applications, you know, neuroscience, which I also can't get into tonight and wouldn't be qualified to talk too much about it, but neuroscience tells us that as people repeat behaviors, we create or strengthen neural pathways, and then those behaviors become more familiar or easier to tap into. And that's what we're offering, that opportunity to the young people who come and try yoga. I was running this talk by one of my friends to get a little feedback. And at the end of telling him all the things that I wanted to talk about, he said to me, "It sounds like you hope for more." And I didn't quite know what he meant. And I said, you know, could you explain what you mean a little bit? And he said, well, it sounds like what you're saying is that what you hope for is more than survival. And I sort of got goosebumps and realized that, like, in that one simple sentence, he had summed up perhaps what motivates me not just in this work, but in my own life. And, you know, when I hear some of the stories that youth tell me after class, when I ask them the simple question, how do you feel at the end of our class? How do you feel? And I very often hear things like, I feel happy. I feel relaxed. I feel like I've had time to think about things that I'm not able to think about in the rest of my life. I feel free. And when you hear those statements, it doesn't matter if you know about the tradition and the teachings of yoga. I think it's very obvious to realize that something more is happening here than just stretching out the hamstrings. And that's what motivates me. And so I think that to realize that many young people in our communities are suffering, and as a result of their suffering, may be causing suffering for other people, then it's important that we create opportunities for them to first recognize these patterns of behavior, to honor how they've adapted to get by, but then to create opportunities to move beyond that. Thank you so much.